and welcome to this episode of BAKUL Talks. Well, for those who are joining in for the first time, we started, of course, the online engagements of the BAKUL Library when the library was closed for COVID. And we started with storytelling programs for children. And then we started our public lecture series, which we used to have at the library and now online. Now, the idea behind the public lectures was that we will have talks by experts, talks and conversations by experts on topics of common interest to any curious individual, irrespective of their disciplinary background or persuasion or training, things that concern everyone and which are kind of interesting and stimulating to intellectuals, but at the same time interesting and intelligible to teenagers. So that was the idea behind BAKUL Talks. It started with a series on the Nobel Prizes of 2020. We had experts speaking on each of the Nobel Prizes and the significance of the work. Those of you who missed it, it is there. You can go to the BAKUL Foundation YouTube channel, the playlist of BAKUL Talks, and you can find the previous talks there. The other series that we started a month back was on the big questions of 2020. And we started with one episode on the farmers' protests, and then on the storm that happened in Bollywood. And of course, the last one was on vaccination, where again, we had a speaker from the US, Professor Emeritus of the University of Alabama School of Public Health was there, along with the doctor here. And today, we are here to discuss about what happened in the US elections, particularly with reference to the storming of the Capitol. Of course, in India, we all remember, we talk about the attack on the Indian Parliament as something that was sacrilege, as something that was so, devastating to the whole imagination. Of course, that was a terrorist attack. But here, when it happened, there were a lot of questions that people in India had, particularly our volunteers had. So when we asked our volunteers, which are the big questions on your mind? Surprisingly or not surprisingly, many people said, we want to know more about what happened in the US Capitol and what led to people, storming the Capitol and the confusions around it. So, and luckily for us, we again have two very good speakers. Let me welcome Bogdan Banu and Niranjan Sahoo. Bogdan is the director at Meridian International Center, but of course, as he will also say, he is here in a personal capacity. Now, the Meridian International Center is something that I had visited way back in 2010 and later on my next visit to the Washington, D.C. Now, Meridian works as a kind of, officially it is called, unofficially, a kind of embassy of Washington, D.C., with thousands of leaders from across the world being hosted there and Meridian actually engaging with thousands of leaders, political leaders, you name it, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, members of parliament, etc. And Bogdan has a strong India connection in the sense that the US consulates and the embassy in India, they get a lot of experts from the US to India to speak on different topics. And Bogdan is the person who manages that entire program and curates it for the US embassy and the consulates. Bogdan, but here, as I said, along with his role with Meridian, he is also someone who's trained in political campaign management. Okay, now I don't know of any Indian university that has a program in that, but there are some American universities that have that, and Bogdan studied political campaign management. He has been an international election observer in many countries and in the US as well. And he is frequently on Romanian TV, speaking on different matters, particularly on matters relating to US and elections, electoral reforms, etc. Now, so this is a topic that Bogdan has already spoken to at many platforms. And as he will say, he just stays next to the Capitol Hill. So he actually saw the drama unfolding. He was almost part of it in a way. So we could not have thought of a better person than him. And the other person who is also our India expert on what happened in the US, Niranjan Sahoo, Dr. Niranjan Sahoo. I call him Nirabhai because he's like an elder brother to me. We went to the same university, and And Nirabhai is with the Observer Research Foundation, which is a leading think tank in India. And he's a senior fellow there, and he heads the governance and electoral reforms unit, the team that works on it. Along with that, of course, he has a strong American connection. He has been part of the Carnegie Endowment, and he's the member for India, on there, working on rising democracies. He has been on many international platforms also, and he has published books on elections and funding in elections in India, which is coming out from Routledge. And he also has publications from the Brookings Press of the United States. I would invite Meerabhai to take the discussion forward with Bogdan. Welcome both of you once again. And for all of you to know, you can type in your questions in the comments box. So after half of the time, that they will have their conversation, where they will address the question that they know will be there on our minds, they will address your questions. So please type in your questions in the comments box. Over to you, Nirabhai.
Thank you, Sujit, for such a fantastic welcome to both of us in this exciting, BAKUL platform. BAKUL Foundation, I mean, many of you may not be knowing that, I was part of in its formative period when, Sujit was actively pursuing the idea of, setting up a BAKUL Foundation in Bhubaneswar and work for the children, especially the street children and those who cannot access the books and other things. And this is where actually, I mean, we had several meetings in Delhi, and we try, this was just for many of you may not be knowing, this was one initiative which actually was largely led by Sujit and many other friends, backed through a crowd funding, kind of online kind of mobilization of resources or thing. And I see it is growing in leaps and bounds, and today it has created a space for itself. And in Odisha especially, BAKUL Foundation occupies a central place actually in terms of pushing art, culture, and sort of discuss. And this particular initiative now, which BAKUL has taken since last couple of weeks, especially curating a very interesting discussion on diverse themes, is a welcome addition. And I hope with Sujit's leadership and others selfless committed work of volunteers and active members, this foundation will continue to grow and make us really feel proud. So I would not waste more time, and I invite Bogdan actually to a very interesting conversation on a theme which Sujit has carefully chosen about. I mean, for many of us in India, it may not even matter the capital insurrection or storming, whichever way you look at on 6th January, because we are far away and we stay in a different kind of comfort zone because US democracy, what happens to it and its institutions, other thing, it's their own internal matter. But that's not as simple as this, because United States is the oldest and the most powerful democracy in the world, and it continues to remain a symbol of hope and aspiration for many democracies, which are many countries which are basically aspiring to become democracy, or democracy that are struggling or navigating through their sort of motion. So United States in many way actually for last almost especially after the Second World War has been playing a seat anchor role in terms of promoting democracy across different continents, and its contribution, despite controversies in certain cases where countries accuse that it has intervened very sort of without any sort of kind of invitation or values or any sort of way, and this has been outright interference. But by and large, if you look at many countries, especially the second and third wave of democratization that happened in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, United States, its role has been very critical in shaping, especially if you look at the Soviet collapse and the way, most of the countries which were actually under Soviet influence and, occupation, especially the Eastern Europe, became, many successful democracies which actually happened within a very short span, have a blessing from the United States. Its agencies, its institutions have actually pioneered and spearheaded many sort of transition, and especially in Asia, in East Asia, if you look at Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and in Southeast Asia, several democracies actually they transited to democracy from authoritarianism to a great extent with their very close alliance with United States. So in a sense, what happens in United States is just not United States own internal affairs. It affects the entire world, especially the liberal democratic order, because United States represents the leader of the liberal order, and today when we are actually debating about the rise of authoritarian China and the kind of interference and threats it poses to liberal values and the sort of rule-based order globally, and much of us in Southeast Asia are affected by China's sort of march in a illiberal way. So United States probably today, despite what happened in January 6th, remains the only probably effective sort of, I would say, check against authoritarian rise of China. And in that sense, we probably need to devote some time to understand what happened actually on Jan 6th, that Capitol storming, and what are the forces and what are the processes that led to such a sort of, I would say, very disturbing kind of event that has actually in many ways created a lot of question mark about the state of democracy in the US, and it's whether democracy is really healthy, or it has actually it suffers from a lot of malaise. So many of those issues will come up in the discussions. And before I actually venture into inviting Bogdan to speak on the 6th January event, I would like for, especially for our viewers who would not have a very, many of you may not have a very kind of clear idea about the political system, the democratic system in United States. I would like to mention that United States is one of the oldest federal countries. It's a federal and republican system in which you have it's a presidential system also. So you have a clear distinction between executive and legislature, unlike India, where parliamentary democracy, you have the prime minister is also elected member of the legislature. So whereas in United States you have a very clear distinctions, and there you have also similar kind of situation like India. We call parliament here, they call Congress there, and you have a House of Representatives, the lower house called there, and then Senate, the upper house. And interesting part about United States is that it has a very complex and very, I would say, complicated electoral system, which some of those things will come in the discussion, especially the mail-in ballot system, which created a lot of controversy during the November election. And then you have basically the collegiate system in which the sort of president is indirectly elected. So a lot of those things will come up. So I think now I'll invite Bogdan to basically take us a quick tour of from based on your own personal observation, what you saw in the Capitol on 6th January. What are the actually events? What are the processes, and what are the real trigger points actually that led to such a kind of event which we haven't actually really seen in United States? There have been smaller events, but events of this nature where thousands of mob are storming the Capitol and seizing almost for several hours, and almost creating a kind of chaos when the Congress was sitting and trying to ratify, and creating a lot of sort of security threats even for the vice president who was very in the close proximity. Probably he escaped from the mob fury. So you're actually probably, you can take us a quick tour and then we'll follow up with follow-up questions. Over to Bogdan.
Thank you, and thank you, Sunjit, for that wonderful introduction at the beginning, and Niranjan, thank you for your questions and for that overview of the U.S. System. I think was mentioned earlier. I actually live about 5 blocks away from the U.S. Capitol building, and as a matter of fact, my apartment building is the closest one to the U.S. Congress. So I get a front row seat to what is going on there, whether I want it or not. So I can speak a little bit about what has happened on January 6th, both from the perspective of someone who's looking more at what had happened with a critical view of someone who is involved following closely U.S. politics, but also just more on a personal or someone who was directly impacted by what has happened that day. And I think if you want to look at January 6th, you have to step back a little bit and not look necessarily at that day, but look at what led to January 6th. And I think there are several things that are worth noting here. One, I would say that we have heard from former President Trump a discussion that started, I would say, as early as the summer over the fact that if he doesn't win the election, that means the election has been a frauded election, and it's not an election that it's been a fair election. And we've heard that discourse starting somewhere back in June and July. And I think that it was in part due to the fact that if you looked at where polling data was and where his chances of re-elections were in February, so prior to COVID and the shutdown that followed in mid-March, Trump was really sailing to a re-election. I think very few people would have ventured to say that he wasn't going to be re-elected to a second term. That's usually the norm, not always, but especially if the economy is doing well, the rule is that the president will be re-elected. And certainly the economy in February was at an excellent point. And Trump's really had some numbers that he could be proud of. It took a dent clearly when the economy shut down. And I think it further took a dent when he mismanaged the response to COVID because it was a response that was not clearly communicated. He downplayed, talked about the fact that we're going to round the corner, this is going to be gone in a day. And meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Americans were dying. So he started questioning the elections when he realized that his polling numbers were going down. And he certainly had his audience. No matter what he did, his hardcore group of supporters stuck with him no matter the controversy that sort of accompanied his 4 years in the terms. But as we're getting closer to the election, we saw this wrench up a rhetoric about the elections being problematic. He started talking about what you have mentioned, this mailing ballots being a way for people to steal the vote. We started talking about illegal migrants and people who don't have the right in the United States voting, talking about millions and millions of votes being casted that should not be. And that sort of muddied the waters because for anybody who looked at the election and for anybody who looked at the process and the fact that these elections have happened in an unprecedented, pandemic mode, the elections were by all measures a success. We had the highest percentage of Americans participating in these elections in over 150 years. I mean, I think the numbers we were looking at were somewhere in like 1908 or even 1800s, we would see this kind of level of participation. And in large, there were no major problems. And we've seen that despite all the accusations and over 60 lawsuits that the campaign of the electoral campaign of President Trump has filed, they found no major issues, nothing certainly that would have overturned the elections. So there was that questioning of it and this rhetoric that the elections is being stolen, that for people who followed what the President Trump had, and he had this gift of sort of overstepping the traditional media, talking to them directly via Twitter and other social media channels and certain TV channels that were radio channels that were very pro-Trump, that his supporters really tuned in and didn't listen to anything else, heard this argument that the elections were being stolen. And when we got to the election day, for anybody who was following, we knew that in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, where Georgia, where was not, the electoral process did not allow for the mailing ballots to be counted prior to the election day, and they will be counted afterwards. We knew that we'll see immediately a shift on the results. And that shift was due to the fact that looking at the data, about 70% of Democrats chose to vote in by mailing vote. And about 70% of the Republicans chose to vote on election day in person. So what that meant is that if you looked just at the data that came in from the day of the election, meaning only from those votes that were cast by people who casted a ballot on that day, overwhelmingly those would have been Republicans. So the numbers for former President Trump would have been very good. But as people started looking at those legitimately cast mailing ballots, and I want to emphasize that those were legitimately cast mailing ballots, we would see those numbers shifted. That was not a surprise for anybody who was someone who followed and understands how the system works. That was not a surprise. But Trump took advantage of the fact that even for Americans, let alone for someone outside the electoral system, it's so complicated, to talk about the fact that these numbers are being stolen, and look, the Democrats are taking control and are stealing this, overlooking the fact that a lot of these elections were run by Republicans, including in Georgia. So to speak of that, it would be difficult, and I'm sure we'll get back to that point. But to your earlier point about the January 6th, once the results started coming in, once President Trump realized that he's not winning, he looked, what are the ways that I might be able to still keep my presidency? And he tried everything possible. And we saw that for the most part, the Republican Party stuck with him, knowing full well that the elections were not problematic, because it's the same senators that were on the same ballot with him. So if those ballots were fraudulent, their election would have been questioned, but they never raised that point.
So you mean to say that ballot, basically mail-in ballot is basically an excuse?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think if we want to talk a little bit about the mailing ballots, I would say two things. First of all, there were states who, even prior to the 2020 elections, have moved in, like states like Oregon, have moved into full mail-in ballots. In other words, there were no longer polling stations that you could go to. And they did this for several reasons. One, logistically was easier. Second, they saw an increase anywhere between 10 to 15% in voter participation. And the safeguards that are in place for this are fairly stringent. So if you choose to mail in your ballot, it has to be put into a separate envelope. It has to be signed. It clearly tells you what are the penalties, and they're pretty stringent. $5,000 and a year in jail, depends from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but somewhere around there in most cases. And when it's received on the other end, they have to match that signature. So there is a verification process that has to take place. So, to talk about the fact that there were fake mailing ballots that were sent in, really it would reflect someone who doesn't have an understanding of how the system works. Because I mentioned to you as we were getting ready to get into this conversation, the mailing ballot is not just for the president. My mailing ballot in the District of Columbia had 18 different questions on it. I also voted for the mayor. I also voted for local council. And District of Columbia, it's actually unusual because we don't have a senator and congressman. But I was talking to friends in Texas, and they had 54 different elections that were in one ballot. They had Senate, House, State Senate, State House, judges, sheriff. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And furthermore, because it gets down to such a small place, the ballot that I get and the ballot that someone gets 3 streets away are not the same. because I will be voting for my local councillor, and so.
This actually, takes me to a kind of, related questions, which, especially based on this particular November elections. So a lot of analysts across the world have been saying that, why US continues with such a complicated and, such a antiquated kind of, system in which you have, not only mail-in ballot, you have actually provisional ballots, drop-off ballots, you have post-dated ballots, and then second thing is why don't you have a kind of federal election commission like India or Brazil or many countries have actually, which does a job very efficiently. Here you have a system where actually even the district level, at the county level, there are electoral officials and they have to count, certify, and it such a decentralized. I know it's a deeply federal country, but doesn't it look like that probably it's in a different century altogether, the electoral system?
I mean, it depends on which side you come to it, because the other people talk about the fact that that's the strength of the system, because it's so decentralized. It will be very difficult to try to steal elections or to influence elections, because again, it comes down to the county, sometimes to the city, that they have their own voting system. So when we talk about elections in the United States, people don't understand that we're not talking about one elections. In reality, we talk about 51 elections, because each state manages their own elections. And in reality, there are 51 Democratic parties and 51 Republican parties, because they all exist at the state level. And I know India has states as well, but in the United States, that system of states, it's much stronger than in India. There are certain ways where, we are a federal republic, and there are a lot of things that states have relinquished in terms of their rights. But there are certain things that I don't think they're really willing to do so. And we've seen over time sort of slowly moving towards more of a not necessarily centralized, but more uniform way of doing the election. In part, that was due to 2000, when we saw that what had happened with Al Gore and his hanging chads in Florida. But I don't think this is going to change. And the bigger issue is the electoral college. People talk about the fact that when I go and actually cast a vote, even though I may check the name of Donald Trump or Joe Biden, in reality, I'm not voting for them. I'm voting for an elector, meaning someone who, in my behalf, will get into the electoral convention and cast a vote. And that's something you're not going to be able to change without having a constitutional reform, which gets to be very complicated in the United States, because it takes a majority of the states, 2/3 of the Senate. It's hard to get to it. But there is something that is happening, and it was actually in the ballots in November, which is an initiative where states would require that electors to be bound not by the results in their state, but by the results at the national level. So we will not see something that what has happened in 2016, when you had Hillary Clinton have 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, and yet still lose the national elections.
This is actually, I think, very interesting point you have raised, because a lot of especially people from this side of the especially the global south, quite often unable to understand how someone actually like Hillary Clinton wins the popular votes, yet she loses the elections. Because here, if you look at in most other democracies, it's about popular numbers. If someone who polls the maximum number of votes wins the A. So could you actually just illustrate that sort of problem basically with the electoral college system, and how entire presidential election is organized? Ultimately, it's about the electoral college. The numbers that someone collects from different states ultimately matters.
Yeah, and one thing I would say when it comes to the electoral college is the fact that it's a legacy of the history of the United States in many ways. If you think about it, in the 1700s, to try to run elections in a country the size of a continent, it was virtually impossible. So the electoral college was sort of the solution, where you could cast these votes at the local level, a month later, these electors would then go and really cast a national vote that would be reflective of what happened at the local level. It was also an issue that dealt with slavery and how those would maybe represented and how much they would be counted towards. But in the end, and if you want, I have an interesting map here that I might be able to share with you guys. Let me try to see if I can share my screen here. I don't know if you are able to see this, but basically this shows you a little.
I think it's open now. It's
sorry. It goes through. So this is sort of the electoral college here, where it shows you that the electoral college is actually reflective of the population of the United States. So the electoral college is reallocated after each census. And we saw actually there's a fight about how the census data from the 2020 U.S. Census will be reflected, and Donald Trump were trying to take out all the people who don't have a legal status in the United States to diminish, in some ways, the representation of states like California, which we know goes heavily towards the Democratic. So in a way, each state we know has at least 3 electors, and that it's the equal number of their federal level elected officials, the 2 senators and 1 representative at the minimum, but also a reflection of their population. So this is, I think, this is the map I was trying to get to. It just shows you a little bit the discrepancy between what, in the top row, you could see the geographic map of the United States and what the winner of the state electoral votes looks like. But when you adjust that to the population, you see that in the end, that discrepancy it's not that big. And the other point I think it's important to make is that the fact that the electoral college, for the most part, has worked in the United States. Throughout the years, what we have seen with Hillary Clinton and what we have seen with the Al Gore's election were really the exceptions, were not the rule.
I think 3-4 times it has been in entire history. So so I agree. I mean, by and large, it has worked successfully, sort of way. But then the problem arises, especially that you won't find actually in another presidential system where actually election is, it happened indirectly through electoral college, intermediary. It's largely through popular votes. So it also puts United States in a very unique position, as a sort of democracy which still has preserved, more than 200 years of, democratic system and processes.
One thing I wanted to say is you talk about the history of it. One of the things that U.S. has prided itself, it's the fact that it's always been a peaceful transfer of power. And this is the one thing that you hear repeated over and over again. And coming back to January 6th, this is where January 6th really is problematic. It was the first breach of the U.S. Congress since the British occupation of Washington, D.C. in 1812. So I mean, it was really unprecedented as what had happened to the Capitol. But more importantly, this whole episode between the November elections and the certification of the new president, Joe Biden, on January 20th, really went to put a dent into that image of a peaceful transfer of power. January 6th certainly was an insurrection, or a targeted attempt to stop the electoral process and the certification of the votes. The fact that President Trump has never conceded publicly the election, to this day, he has not uttered the words that I have lost the election, and continues. I saw him on TV yesterday continue to talk about the fact that he believes that these elections were stolen, when there's really no proof to it. It really what marks, and I think to your earlier point, the fact that U.S. is being seen as a beacon and as an example of democracy. I think that's the biggest impact of what has happened in January 6th. It's sort of tarnishing that image.
Tarnishing. In fact, you actually, this is where I wanted to also take you to the very related, theme. Why do you think actually that sort of thing emerged like, a peaceful transfer of, power? which is a hallmark of any democratic system, unlike authoritarian or the system where you have bloodshed and a lot of thing happens. And US is a prime example of that. It never happened in its entire political history, if you look at. So I think what actually led to such a kind of I would say very sharp divide, because what you remarked in your earlier sort of saying that the Trump supporters are actually just believing what he's saying, and many of them are most of them are educated. Very it's not that they are ignorant or illiterate or the thing they carried out by misinformations. So I'm saying, is that something to do with the growing, continuing divide in America, the political system, the polarization that we have witnessed between Republican and Democrat? They don't see eye to eye, and it's like it's like a war. Election is no longer kind of peaceful transfer of power. It's seen as it's like a zero-sum game. That is one. And second, what role also the social media, misinformation, and what we are witnessing a kind of conspiracy theories, which is actually thriving in a sort of I would say very very bizarre way, because information is so freely available, and most of the people have access to internet and all digital platform. Yet a lot of people still believe with those misinformation and conspiracy theory. What do you think actually? Is going on actually, and what kind of way this actually potent for the United States in future? Because this is not going to disappear with Biden's Biden's being in the office.
It's hard, I think, for people abroad to grasp the divide that exists in the United States these days. It really is an unprecedented situation that we're all in, and I don't know if that exists anywhere else in the world. People do live literally in two parallel realities. And in a way, I feel lucky that I have studied politics, and I was mentioned earlier, I got my master's in campaign management. And one of the things when you're studying politics in the United States is that you get friends who are from the entire spectrum of the political spectrum. So I get a chance to see what my Republicans friends are saying and what my hardcore Democrats friends are saying. And really, they look at the same information and perceive it completely different. And actually, this was something that I've studied in great deal, and it all in many ways starts back in 1980s with a speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives who had this deal with America, the New Deal with America, and he Newt Gingrich set about to reshape the electoral aspect of the United States. And he did something where was very brilliant at that time, realizing that local election, nobody was really paying attention to them. Nobody's putting money in those local elections. And he went on to win the local state election. In other words, the House and Senate in the state of Florida, state of Georgia. And why that mattered is because it's these state legislators who are drawing the congressional maps. And I think people, even in India, I'm sure, heard this term gerrymandering, which basically means drawing electoral maps around your voters in a way that you secure your votes to you. And what we are seeing nowadays, it's the result of what has happened back in 1980s, because we see a more polarized Congress, but that polarized Congress is the result of these districts who are no longer reflective of the America. They're districts that are either heavily Republican and heavily Democrat. So when you're running in a heavily Republican district, to win that vote, you have to move further to the right. You have to appeal to that Republican more and more. Same thing on the Democratic side. You have to move more and more to the left. So senators like John McCain, who prided it being in that middle, are really gone out of the legislature of the United States. So if you look at the map that starts from the 1980s, where they were sort of ranking Republican and Democratic congressmen and senators based on where they stood in their affiliation, there was a lot of overlap. That purple America, that basically doesn't exist anymore. So what that translates in is also the fact that people are tuning in and listening to the things that they're most comfortable with. And now when you have so many TV channels and so many news channels that you can tune into, you don't want to hear things that make you uncomfortable. So I'm going to be listening to the things that make me reinforce or revalidate my own belief system. So I think the solution to that, because it really is a problem, and you heard that, I think I covered the inauguration for Joe Biden for the Romanian television, and I was commenting on his inauguration speech, and the word you heard the most was the word unity.
Unity.
And I think there's a conscious effort in many parts of the American political establishment to try to address this divide that exists. And you see that in concrete steps being done, in the sense that they are now moving to setting up independent commissions that would redraw this electoral colleges. We saw that starting in Pennsylvania. We saw that in Arizona, so that you will have more of the purple senators and congressmen and not these hardcore red and blue states that we see right now, and more of a reflection of this. And then to the second part of your question about the disinformation, I think that existed in some ways prior to social media really taking off. But really, what we are all being caught in is the fact that we're in front of internet, in front of WhatsApp. I know it's really big in India, and but people are not really literate in the terms of how do I validate that information. You see something, and everybody who's a journalist or a quasi-journalist rushes to be first with a story without really fact-checking those stories anymore. And you, as a consumer of news, you think you're relying on them having done their due diligence when they present that story, but that's really not the case. And we saw then the influence of malign actors, Russians, Iranians, North Koreans, who really had an interest in seeing one candidate or another in the US election, really planting stories. And there was a lot of studies that was being done, especially around the 2016 election. Clearly Russian influence into changing the mind of the electorate, because again, the electoral system itself is so complicated, you couldn't change that. So the only way you can affect the election is by trying to affect the electors. So those
basically influence operation, and 2016 we saw a lot of talk about Russian influence operation largely through Facebook and Twitter and other things. And this election, I think probably we didn't hear much about the foreign influence other thing. But as you said correctly, misinformation spread largely through all these social media tools, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp and several other which are streaming to millions of people. I mean, if you look at actually even a lot of those conspiracy theories, and people also like we saw actually the news that millions of Republicans also started their own setup. Something in which is in fact beginning, something is happening in India right now. A lot of right wing supporters are actually starting their own something called very, very interesting development here happening. So what I actually wanted to say basically is that social media, the technology, especially the way it's mediating with the democratic politics, is do you think actually in many ways the leaders, the system, the institutions are actually losing control, and especially the traditional media, the way they used to at least regulate and have certain editorial kind of control that is missing in the social media age, where you have Facebook, which is basically minting profit, or other platforms. They basically they have a revenue model. They are not doing social service or any kind of public service here. So how do we actually in a sense address these issues? If you look at because these tools had a role in Jan 6th event, what happened in the Capitol.
Absolutely, and we know that people on January 6th were because there are a lot of people that already the storming of the Capitol started as Trump was speaking. But people were following him on their social media, and we saw videos of them broadcasting on loudspeakers his discourse via using social media channels. And it's true that we're seeing now people migrating away from it. But it's a very interesting conundrum that we're in, because Facebook, Twitter, and name it, they're private companies. But they've been asked now to come in and regulate a public discourse. So the question that remains to be answered, and I don't think anybody has come up with an answer, is can you regulate public discourse on a private platform in a way that you dictate to that private platform on how to do it? We saw that what happened in Australia with Facebook taking out because they didn't agree with the policy there. And Facebook was in a Twitter were in a very interesting situation because I think one, they were caught off guard in 2016 by how sophisticated Russian influence was. And so the measure they took now was to sort of ban political advertisement from the outside, to try to clamp down on it. But what do you do when one of the candidates is the one who peddles fake news and conspiracies? Do I mute that candidate? Is my role as a private company to take away his right to speak? I mean, in the United States, is this issue of constitutionality of the freedom of speech that really complicates things, because in a lot of other countries, you have freedom of speech to a point. You cannot, insult royalty in certain countries, or you cannot sort of have a coarse dialogue towards someone, an elected official in a public. That doesn't exist here. You can pretty much say whatever you want, and there's really no legal consequence of saying that. But also that comes in with a baggage that I can say fake things. I can peddle fake things, and there's no repercussion for it. So Absolutely. If you don't have an educated, and I don't mean educated in a scholarly way educated, but I would think the more correct, if you don't have an electorate who knows how to be informed about the information that is being provided to it and educated about that information, you get to the result where you have significant parts of the electorate believing all of these fake news that are coming from the candidate themselves.
Absolutely. And before I move to the next, sort of question, I would request anybody who is participating in this conversations, if they have anything to raise, any question or any comments, other thing, they are free to hear, because we have now some space for the Q&A. So you are most welcome. And Sujit, do we have sort of any question so far, or
there's one? I think someone is typing, but you ask the next question, and I would request, as Neerabhai said, please type in your questions in the comments box. I request everyone, wherever you are seeing it, on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, please type in your questions there, and we'll pose it to the speaker.
Okay, great. Now, I think we have covered within a span of 40 minutes broad range of issues, starting with the electoral system, technologies, social media, polarization, and host of issues. And just wanted to know from you, because you have been closely observing and witnessing to many of those events. This January 6th event, do you think in some way or other signals that it's also the elite failure, the failure of elites and failure of the party system? Because if you look at the January 6th, November election, and then the weeks of accusation and counter accusation by Democrats and Republicans, and then the most actually unusual thing is that Republicans, most of the Republican members backing the president, despite the fact they know what is the truth, and then after the entire thing, if you look at after the event, this entire impeachment thing also got totally completely polarized and divided, on partisan line. So if you look at it, do you think actually it's also failure of elites and failure of the party system? Because ultimately, if you want to see any improvement in American democratic system, these are the key stakeholders, but they are unwilling to actually accept their, and they're still living in their sort of theories and beliefs.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation, and again, I go back to the what I was saying that Newt Gingrich did back in 1980s, and how do you undo that? Because if you don't start from the grassroots, the politicians are a reflection of the electorate, and the electoral nowadays, it's very divided. And also, I think there's a real divide in the United States between urban and rural areas. I like to go out into the mountains here, and as soon as you get outside of the urban areas, there were Trump flags everywhere. As soon as you got into the towns, and I was mentioning earlier that I worked on a project where we worked with 250 journalists from around the world to help them cover remotely the U.S. election, and we actually hired local producers. And one of the things we were running into is that if I was trying to get a balanced view and show both Trump signs and Biden signs, and you really have to go to two different physical places in the country to be able to do this. So not only are people being now divided ideologically, but they're physically separating each other into communities that tend to be Republican and Democrat. And again, it stems back from that idea of that Newt Gingrich had about how do you create these safe spaces for electors. I think we got to step away from that. And what is happening in some of these states where you have independent commissions, we're drawing congressional districts that are more reasonable, more reflective of the communities that these people are being elected from. But that's a process that's going to take time. And I think we're not going to be able to see the results of that until, 15, 20 years from now, the same way we're now ripping the effects of what happened in the 1980s of that. So are politicians failing? Politicians in many ways, I think, are failing because they see themselves hostage to that extreme electorates and not to the broader electorate that they may be representing. So I think the negative consequences of what we've seen in the past 4 years for the U.S. electoral system, it's the fact that Trump's style of politics, whether Trump comes back or not, and that remains to be seen. And we saw a lot of Republican leaders saying yesterday that if he runs, if he decides to be a candidate in 2024, he still has the first chance to be again the Republican nominee. It's his style of politics. And I don't think that helps the discourse because his style of politics was name calling and a very superficial way of not really diving down into the subject matter and understanding what the problem is to come up with a solution. It was always this sort of cuff remarks and really guts reaction to the politics. And really, that's not how you do politics at the high level.
I mean, that's a very interesting point you said, his style of politics, what Trump actually did is, that kind of a populist demagogue, kind of style in which he almost, captures the entire, mind space of the Republican voters. And in a sense, he's the person who monopolizes, it's not the party, party organization that, controls, this sort of way. So this is a kind of new phenomena which are not only witnessing in the United States, you can actually see across many democracies. You look at Brazil, you look at India, you look at Turkey, you look at several even in Indonesia, and many cases where populist, leaders who have used nationalism, who have used, sort of immigration, jobs, and many other, populistic kind of, ideas to basically, it's create kind of a referendum and put it like us versus them. And that actually is in many ways also at the core of, what happened in January 6th, because in many ways, and for them, the fantastic tool has come is technology, the social media. because now they don't have to go through the party organization to reach out to the people. They directly connect with the masses through their Facebook, through their Twitter, through their other channels. So in a sense, they have bypassed the party system by party organization in many ways. So this is actually is kind of problem that we probably didn't witness in the democratic system in the earlier decades. So it's what happened in United States. We might soon actually see similar trends actually happening in many other democracies, where even the leaders who popular leader and populist leader who get defeated would actually not like to accept that they have lost. They probably can egg their supporters, other thing, come and and Gherao and sort of congregate and nullify what we witnessed actually in Africa and in other parts in the 70s and 80s, where actually many of those leaders actually they mobilized other thing and they never accepted sort of electoral loss. But here it's happening in a different fashion. So we have a question now. How exactly can we stop incident like Capitol Hill? Considering, that's in fact there's something my next question would have been for you. So Subhasri has raised these questions. So which way you think actually this sort of trend can be in any way addressed, and we can ensure that such repeat doesn't happen in future?
So I think it goes to the point that you were just making here about the fact that you see this very divisive and dialogue that comes out, or discourse that comes out from the politicians, that really hits at a few divisive issues that really impact the voter, not on a more emotional way, rather than a way that they get to think about the matters. And it goes back to again to something that you said earlier, that the moral example that the United States set to the world. And again, I think that was the biggest impact January 6th has, is that it dented that beacon the United States was in terms of peaceful transition of power. But more broadly, Trump's politics was embraced by a lot of these politicians because they saw it. So again, the United States sets an example. And if a lot of people saying, if it's okay for the president of the United States to call all the media outlets fake news, it's perfectly fine for me to do the same thing. So when it comes to the Capitol Hill, what can we do to stop this? I think, first of all, you have to have an electorate that, and you have to have elected officials that are much more responsive in their public discourse. Because going in and inflaming without proof the fact that this is a fake election has consequences, and everybody kept telling to Donald Trump's discourse will have consequences, and I don't think anybody expected that those consequences will be what we saw on January 6th. I will tell you one thing: the Capitol building, it's still surrounded by a 2.5 meter fence with barbed wire at the top. And the security perimeter, it's huge. It actually encompasses, and it's hard to comprehend how big that is. And it's still there. There are National Guards still stationed there. Thousands of heavily armed National Guards are still there. I was in Baghdad, and when I was telling my friends that this reminds me of Baghdad at the height of the Iraq War, people were joking, but really that's the image that evoked in so many people's mind. And I'm afraid that we will see a response similar to what we've seen around the White House when the Oklahoma bombing happened, and the Pennsylvania Avenue was closed in front of it. And now White House looks like a fortress with a huge, security perimeter, and no longer being able to go inside the White House. I mean, one was a thing that was really interesting about the U.S. Congress is that me as a U.S. citizen, I could go in and walk into a senator's office that represented me, and it was free access. You just, you go to metal detectors, but more or less you are unhinged to, not a problem to walk around. Same thing for Capitol. You could book a tour the same day and see most of it. I don't know if that's going to be back.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunate.
Very unfortunate. No, I mean, I have been there a couple of times, in both White House and Capitol, and met number of times, senator and others during my kind of US trip especially to the DC. So I don't think that's really possible. And in fact, in India, we have also witnessed similar kind of trend when our parliament building was attacked in 2001 by the terrorists, and other thing. After that, it has been heavily securitized. Even the member of parliament, to enter parliament, they have to also go through barrages, kind of formality. So in a sense, I would agree with what you are saying. Probably this is going to be a permanent fixture, especially after this event. Now, we have another question, a very interesting question. In fact, I had noted down to ask, who are those actually people, who actually stormed the Capitol? Especially, Price is raising about the identity of, sociological identity of this group, composition of this group, basically the right-wing mob. Who are they and what sort of their profile?
So I have to say, I went to Trump's rallies that happened after the election. So the rally on January 6th was the third in a series of other rallies that were organized. This was clearly, and we saw the same kind of crowds come to those. And I was actually, I went there I go to all the events, regardless. When you live in Washington, D.C., you go to all the inaugurations, no matter whether you voted for that president or not. I think people who live here take pride on the fact that they have that chance to be part of history, no matter what part of the political spectrum. And I go to a lot of the political rallies because they're just right behind my building, and sometimes I can't escape them, whether I want it or not. But I made a point to go to this just to see who are the people coming to these rallies. And I have to say, there were at least one or two moments where I felt not safe. I remember particularly a group of these Proud Boys with their very much military style gear. They had bulletproof vests, they had military helmets on, they had their insignia with Proud Boys. Probably, I would say it was a group of 100 or so that really walked around me on both sides. I was on a bike and I just happened to stop to see who's coming, and these guys sort of showed up. But I was filming on January 6th, groups of people walking towards Capitol dressed in military fatigue, wearing, again, these military helmets. I actually saw someone with a gun pointing out, and in Washington, D.C., it's a strictly no gun carrying state. And we saw even signs announced 2 days before, posted by the D.C. Metropolitan Police on all the public areas, informing people who come from places where carrying a gun is perfectly okay, that in D.C. that's not allowed, and that there's a penalty for that, knowing exactly that these kind of people are coming. So there were, first of all, I would say there was a different group who was at the rally on January on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue by the White House, and some of those who stormed the Capitol. So I think it's important to make that distinction, because a lot of President Trump supporters who were nonviolent were part of that rally by the White House, and at his request walked towards the Capitol. And then we're already meeting there a group who was already there. And clearly, we're talking about extreme right groups who are present. We saw a lot of discussions about Antifa and this left group being there, and provocateurs trying to really steal it and make this. But there's really been no proof of it. And if you look at, they're all coming up to 300 arrests now, and all the people who have been identified, they, for the most part, come up from these extreme right groups. And we saw on the insignia that is being flown, these Nazi-inspired flags. And we saw for the first time ever a Southern flag being walked through the U.S. Congress. Yes. I mean, it's hard to comprehend for people what the symbolism of that is in this country, which was, fought a civil war over this. And now to see that flag being proudly walked by some people.
Flag which supported slavery. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah. So I think in terms of the supporters, the ones who stormed, I wanted to make that distinction because I think that was important. And if you looked even at the image, there were still a lot of people when they got there and they saw what was happening around the Capitol building, sort of kept their distance and stood back. But there was also a core group of people who either were affiliated with extreme core or really believed on the message that President Trump said, to hold this elected official responsible for trying to steal his election, who stormed the Capitol.
Very, very well. I think gave a fantastic account of, from your own personal observation also. And the next question, very interesting questions by Kirot Maharana. A person I know him. He's a faculty. He's a uh, anthropologist in one of the premier universities in India, Allahabad University. So he has raised a very kind of a question that if this thing happens in the oldest democracy, and what sort of it sends for a democracy like India, and he's also raising another very important question that many of us are debating. For last quite some times about democracy fatigue. So would you like to comment something on? These two things. One is democracy fatigue, and then what sort of message it sends actually for other democracies like India.
So I don't want to venture in speaking about what's happening in India, because while because of my nature of my job, I do keep an eye on what's going on there. I don't think I'm versed enough to really comment on that. But I would say that the message that was sent by January 6th is that it legitimized questioning election results in a way that we have not seen before. I mean, the electoral process was considered sacrosanct in this country. And really, we had no president prior questioning the electoral results and continuing to do so to this day. And really go to length that go beyond what was constitutionally allowed and permissible to do so. And I think that is the damage, because it allows leaders in other countries who may have authoritarian inclinations to do the same thing and feel perfectly justified, because, hey, if the beacon of democracy, United States, has done this, why is it not okay for me to do the same thing? And it goes back to the same thing as it's sort of questioning the media, calling everybody that disagrees with you fake news and fake media just because they're critical of something that you have done, really undermines the role of media as the sort of the fifth pillar of a democratic state. And we've seen that in places like Turkey, in places like Russia, where there's no longer a democratic media or a free media. And we will see them feeling maybe emboldened to question the electoral results if they don't go their ways, because, hey, it happened in the United States, why not do it here? And when it comes to democracy fatigue, I think there's a case to be made about that. And we saw there are countries where they don't have a long democratic history who sort of have a preference for strong elected figures who very easily can slip into an authoritarian stuff. That's, I think, the case of Turkey. It's probably the most public one that at least that I'm familiar with. But I'm sure there are many other places where that is happening.
In Europe also you can find some of them.
Yes, Hungary, absolutely, Poland. So there's places, and I think what needs to happen is to actually have a system that is strong, because despite everything that happens, and despite the fact that we might not be able to say that there was a peaceful transfer of power in the end, it wasn't peaceful. It was because of what happened in January 6th, but the actual transfer of power on January 20th, it was peaceful. And yes, it was unusual. Donald Trump wasn't present there. There weren't all these pomp and little things, but those are more not legal requirements, were just sort of norms of things that have happened before. But the system itself, because it was a resilient system in the United States, still made sure that January 20th happened, and it happened in a peaceful way. I don't know if that's true in every other case. And I hope that now we will see back a discourse from this administration where it promotes democratic values, because we know that was something that the Trump administration shied away from. And it promotes this idea of free elections, and I think of informed elections. And I think that's something that needs to be made clear, that we need to have elections where the voters are informed in a way that it's unbiased and free of fake news. And that's a long way to go.
I agree. But to take forward from point where you left, actually, basically, if you look at, the India question, what happens to if it can happen in a sort of oldest, most robust democracy like United States, especially about, overturning a sort of election and results and peaceful transfer for at least for few weeks, where went through a kind of suspension, and ultimately the democratic system prevailed. But if you look at the kind of comparison with what happened in United States, it actually opens our eyes and ears in India, because we also, as a sort of a democratic polity, are also witnessing to a very severe polarization in last few years. I would say that at least 6-7 years, this country is going through massive kind of political divide. If you look at the ruling party and the oppositions, they don't see eye to eye. Now, what we witnessed in United States, which ultimately led to this January 6th event, that political divide, key political parties, they were fighting election like, almost like a zero-sum game. It's like a war. So we are almost similarly witnessing, may not have reached the kind of level of Republican versus Democrat, but here we have also almost all the signs of things which are actually looks very worrisome. Our media space is very badly divided, which never used to be so polarized earlier. Now you have a sections of media which is completely go by the government, what it says, the ruling party, and then you have another set of media which is just anything government does, they will oppose. Civil society is also badly divided. You have political, the supporters also, they see almost like us versus them kind of things, and which is a permanent feature of US for last at least 30 years or so. So in a sense, this has also impacted our democratic institutions. Earlier, we used to take pride in many of our democratic institutions, whether it's investigating agencies or even the judiciary, even in electoral office, which earlier used to perform very independently and autonomously. Today faces a lot of questions, although they have not completely given up their constitutional duties and other thing. In many cases they are standing up, but we are actually seeing very sharp erosion and kind of which raises that tomorrow and India is unfortunately also going through the same kind of populistic kind of demagogic kind of way what we witnessed in Trump's US. So in a sense, we have popular leaders both at the state level as at the federal levels, and some of them monopolize entire not only the political space as well as the financial and other space. So that actually really raises a question that India may actually hopefully we will not, but there is no way we can rule it out. Actually, this sort of thing may happen. And that is where actually we need to actually take enough steps and learn something from United States experience, that you can't take democracy for granted. It's a democracy is about every day you have to
Work
actually
in progress.
Exactly, and you have to earn the kind of system. So it's like citizens, the civic participations, and then civic educations, what you call informed voters, informed citizenry is the way to go. There is meanwhile we have Orissa Patnaik has raised something about where should we draw a line between freedom of expression and allowing the hate speech and falsified information. Basically, she's talking about about the misinformation spread by the Trump administrations and the way Trump actually tried to capitalize in cash, especially by misleading his own followers, which ultimately led to a great extent 6th January events. So would you like to say, you have already said something, but I think maybe a minute you can actually reflect.
Sure. I wanted to your point about what is happening in India and what is happening in the United States. I think one of the reasons the system in the United States ultimately worked is because the system here, it's a very clear divide between the level of political appointees and the administration itself and the rest of it, which is non-political. And I know in many countries, when a party comes, they basically appoint their people from top to bottom throughout the administration. And what the effect of that is that those institutions sort of become dependent or clients of a certain political party or a certain political leaning. And in the United States, from this level up, yeah, it's a political appointee. Whenever the new administration comes in, they have their resignations on the desk for the new president, but the people below that level really stay and do their job. And then it's not really at the low level. I would say it's almost to the upper echelons that the system itself, it's not politicized. And I think that is very crucial. And it's one of, I think, the hallmarks of the more solid democracies, not just the United States, but if you look in Western Europe and other places where the democracy functions well, is you have this very core of professional bureaucrats, if you will, and they are bureaucrats, who are not really tied to one political party or another. To the question of freedom of expression and hate speech, I think what complicates things is that a lot of our discussion between political discourse happens now on a private space. Facebook, it's a private platform. Twitter, it's a private platform. So they have their own set of rules in terms of what it's permissible and what it's not. And that is really not tied to this idea of freedom of speech, because they're not bound by that. If you don't like their rules, go to another platform. Nobody makes you be on Facebook or on Twitter. So it's left then on a private company to try to monitor fake news and hate speech. And do they do a good job with that? Maybe no, maybe yes. Ultimately, their interest, it's a commercial interest. So we only saw them really take a measure to address these when it started to hurt their bottom line, because people started to complain about the effects and starting to say, I'm tuning away from Facebook because I'm seeing all these fake news. I don't want to be on it. So when people started to click away, we saw these companies really take stand. And I think we saw the struggle both Facebook and Twitter had with President Trump, because President Trump in many ways made Twitter what it is today. Had it not been on it, there wouldn't be the million of people that would log in every day just to see what Trump said today.
Very true.
So how do I monitor that? Because me as a company, Trump being a consumer of my product is beneficial to me, regardless of what he says. And where is my civic duty as a company then to monitor what he says? And is my role to do that, to monitor what a public elected official says and does? Really, that's a very complicated position that these companies have been in. I think the other role is what media should be doing. And you're talking about what is happening in India, where the media is on the pocket of one political party or the other, and we see the same thing here. And
almost like the replay of Fox versus CNN, kind of thing in United States. Yeah.
And it's worrisome because I through my work I do a lot of program on journalism, and I've been doing this job for 20 years. And I remember when we would bring journalism and we take them to the journalism schools and we talk about the ethics of journalism and what it means to have free reporting and fact checking. I don't see any of that being discussed nowadays. And unless you get to that, it's hard to see how you're going to have any kind of check in on hate speech and fake news if that benefits in the end the party, and therefore the media will be paddling the same kind of stories.
We have one more question. Meanwhile, Susri has raised a very, this question can take an entire session about, freedom of speech, which is seen as, especially the dissent and, someone who raises uncomfortable question about the government or does a protest, they're imprisoned in India, which actually, if you look at, this is a very, very disturbing development. In fact, day before we had a 21-year young climate activist who were, put in the police custody for 10 days just by tweeting a kind of toolkits that's called a kind of about the India's farmers protest, ongoing farmer protest. And then she got a bail actually after a particular judge actually really applied his mind and stood up to the kind of pressure and gave her the bail. So unfortunately, to put it, this particular thing is not just about the ruling party. It is about institutions. It's about the criminal justice system. It's about the policing. It's about the judiciary. I think most of them are not playing their roles. Actually, they're supposed to play their constitutional roles, their administrative roles. They are actually not exercising. For instance, in India, we have hundreds of cases in the last couple of years. It's happening not only at the federal level, at also state level, which have different political dispensations. There could be BJP, there could be Congress, there could be any other party. Each one of them is actually resorting anybody who raises uncomfortable questions or criticizes the government, or activist who is busting a scam or something, is quickly put with all kind of false charges by the police and put behind the bar. And charges are put for even smallest offense or smallest kind of accusation is sedition laws and anti-terrorist laws, UAPA, in India are put, and those laws actually are such that you won't get a bail. You will be there actually for months, actually rotting in the jails. And so here the issue is that ultimately you'll get the bail, but the process itself is a punishment. And most of the governments, both at the center as well as the states, are using it. So this is actually a reflection of the weakness of the institutions, because police is working more like a sort of tool of the government, whichever government in the power. It is not applying or autonomously functioning. And second thing is what's actually happening is the judiciary. I think the biggest in India, the biggest concern is about the way higher as well as lower judiciaries are functioning. With some exception, in most of the cases, judges are actually going by whatever the executive wishes. Whether that particular person to be in jail for a few months or other things. So they will not pay. So bail should be a norm, but unfortunately, bail is becoming the last thing, and jail is becoming the first thing. So this is something very serious, and we unfortunately don't have much clue unless these institutions really exercise. And here especially I would blame the judiciary, which is not really playing the role it is supposed to do. Put a check on executive sort of excesses. That's not happening in India, which in the earlier decade witnessed judicial activism and so much of resurgence from the courts.
So this goes back to what I was saying for a second, and the fact that you have these systems that are being politicized. The police is politicized, the judiciary and the judges are politicized, and that's what has not happened in the United States, and that's why the system resisted to that. But I'm afraid that trend is going here too. We saw how politicized the nominations to the Supreme Court were. So, and that was, if you ask Trump what was his biggest accomplishment, was really packing the courts with judicial nominations that were of judges that were like-minded, so to speak.
Great. I think U.S. elections and then that entire thing that happened in January 6th in many ways is a testimony that despite politicization and all sort of things in United States, judicial system has withstood, those say, and even electoral system, despite being very decentralized, and partisan in many way, but most of them have stood to the pressure and exercise, apply their minds. So that's actually is something positive. Still, feel good about the United States, that everything is not lost. Despite this event or the thing, the institutions still remain robust, and they are performing their constitutional duties despite the pressure and pulls and polarization and many other. Now, one question is about whether this Jan 6th insurrection had any bearing on the coup actually that we saw on 1st February in Myanmar. Since I'm actually writing on this issue, I would say not really. I mean, that coup has a different sort of context, and it has a sort of election. Basically, again, they are the November elections in Myanmar, which actually went massively in favor of the National League of Democracy, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, who is actually who is seen as a sort of someone becoming far more popular and becoming a threat for the military junta. So in a sense, actually, this made the military process insecure, and this is who actually apparently is basically to cut her wings and ensure a election within a year's time, so that the military will have an upper hand. So the military basically got insecure. They felt that gradually they will lose their upper hand in the electoral politics of the Myanmar. How does the US, which is classified as failed, that's a very debatable thing. But I think I would ask because since I've also been into many of these exercises by the Freedom House and International Idea, so I know some of the methodology how they categorize what is a failed democracy. But I would request Bogdan to comment, because it's about United States.
I'm curious what it's EIU, because I'm not sure I know what that is.
Economist Intelligence Unit.
Okay.
It does a survey actually every year. Yeah.
Funny, a friend of mine is actually gave a speech on what's happening next from the Economist Intelligence Unit yesterday, and I was watching what she had to say. But to the first part of the question about Myanmar, and actually Myanmar is a country that I follow somewhat closely. I was in Myanmar in, I think, 2014. I think it's hard not to see some parallels between what the military leaders were saying in terms of the elections being stolen and being fraudulent, and the discourse that we saw from President Trump. It will be very hard not to draw parallels between those two, because we saw those parallels. So in that regards, I think they saw themselves maybe more justified in making those accusations. I don't know if I would lay the blame of them sort of overthrowing the legitimate government based on what happened in January 6th. That might be a step too far. But I think certainly they felt emboldened having that kind of discourse publicly by seeing that coming from the previous White House. In terms of how the U.S. pulls itself up, whether it's a failed democracy or a failing democracy,
it's not. I mean, I think he has actually written something. It's by mistake. It's not failed. What I've seen actually from EU index is flawed, basically, because India is also categorized as flawed democracy. Both the United States and India are in the category of flawed democracy. So, yeah.
So I think. Again, I come back to what I was saying earlier. I think it needs to have some sort of a reform of the electoral system. The problem is giving the constitutional constraints that are in place. The way you achieve that is very, very difficult. Again, I think some of the things that we were seeing where these states are signing this compact, where if you get to the point where you have a majority of the states abiding by this rule that their electors will vote for the popular vote, not for the results in their states, you will have a paradigmal shift in terms of how the elections will be carried out. And you're never going to see a differentiation between the popular vote and the electoral vote. So I think that's a way that they found to sort of circumvent the constitutional constraints and not change the electoral system per se. The second thing, I think, is that divide that exists and how you would readdress that. And I talked about it, I don't want to come back, but the one thing I have not mentioned, it's the finances of the campaigns in the United States. And we've seen time and time again, laws being brought in, trying to put a restriction in terms of campaign finance laws, transparency in this, and then a few years later, courts more or less throwing those out. To the point where right now you have through these political action committee that are so prevalent, unfiltered and non-transparent money being poured in campaigns in a way that is unprecedented, and that really it's a problem that needs to be addressed. So I think those are the three factors that I think that you look to if you really want to address the state of the democratic process in the United States.
Wonderful. I think I think we should now probably close this with Sujit giving his sort of closing remarks and vote of thanks. But this 1.5 hours has been a fantastic, I think, sort of conversations and probably we covered a wide canvas, so many issues probably which we didn't even initially, thought of, to cover. So I think starting with the January 6th event and what are the factors and forces, that led to that particular tragic episode, and, then people associated with that, the role of political parties, the elite's failure, then the polarization. We have covered, range of, reforms that are needed to, get the US democratic system on a sort of stage where actually it will continue to, inspire other democracies. And then, of course, India stories, and how it many other democracies are linked to the 6th January events and what message it sends. So I think it was a great, sort of a conversation, and I need not give a vote of thanks. I leave that to Sujit, but it was a great. I enjoyed the conversations. Yes, Sujit.
Thank you very much, both of you. Definitely, I mean, I enjoyed the conversation a lot. And so many insights that I got. But before I give my vote of thanks, I would want Bogdan to respond to Orissa's question on whether Trump should have been impeached. Bogdan, I was imagining if America had not been a democracy where there are these checks and balances that are still functional, that even after the storming, there is a system that brings it back to order. If it had been a rogue state, maybe with your vantage point, you would have been seeing people being beheaded or guillotined or whatever. So we are lucky that, it is still, the democracy has flaws, but it is still there. But yes, would you think, or would many Americans that think that Trump should have been impeached, as Orissa asked?
So I think if you looked at public opinion for the first time ever, you had a majority of Americans, and I don't remember, I've seen different numbers, 51, 54, depending on polling data, but on all polling data that I've seen, you had a majority of the people who think that Donald Trump should have been impeached. As a matter of fact, he was technically impeached because the impeachment process happens in the House. So the House brought that accusation and was voted. He wasn't removed from the office because the 2/3 majority lacked. But I think the important point that needs to be made here is twofold. One, Trump will remain in history as the only president that was impeached twice. Never happened before. And second, the impeachment vote was the most bipartisan impeachment vote ever, with the fact that you had so many Republicans, not enough, but so many Republicans voting for the impeachment spoke to what it is. And I think the other aspect that was very interesting is that the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate came in, and even though he voted not to impeach Donald Trump, had one of the most damning condemnation of Donald Trump. And he said that the only reason he didn't vote for the impeachment is because they questioned the constitutionality of impeaching a president when he's no longer a president. And there were a lot of debates on whether that was a constitutional thing. But I think the problem is that by not impeaching the president for what has happened, you leave open the door to presidents to basically do nilly-willy what they want towards the end of their presidency, because they know there will be no consequences to their action as far as impeachment process is concerned.
Yeah, in fact, I have been an avid follower of the web series House of Cards, and I felt it was happening right in front of me.
I think House of Cards were jealous of that they haven't thought about some of these things, and
real life became more interesting than fiction.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, there is, of course, Pranay has made an observation about agreeing with Niranjan, and Vinayak Pal has some questions, but I think Niranjan, you'll have to address him personally. We have run out of time. It's already 1.5 hours. Thank you very much, Bogdan and Niranjan. I think it was wonderful that we had the two of you who complemented each other so well. From someone, Niranjan, of course, has written about what happened in the Capitol, and from a political observer perspective. But this direct bird eye view that you have had, Bogdan, and which you brought to the table in terms of, like, whether you were talking about the people who actually stormed, when you were there, or seeing the things as they were unfolded with your direct eyes, I think that was something that we could not have had. And it was wonderful that Nirabhai, you were there to bring in the Indian perspective, because obviously, someone asked when we advertised this program, one young person said, "Aren't you interfering in American internal affairs?" Of course, he was joking about how India responds when someone makes a comment about something happening in India. And this is India's internal affairs. You are no one to comment. And I think Nirabhai mentioned very nicely that because it has implications for democracy everywhere else. I think Martin Luther King had said that very interesting thing. I forget what exactly he had said. I think injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right?
Justice everywhere.
Something like that. So,
True.
and definitely America being the oldest democracy and being iconic of democracy. In fact, India and America are the two countries that people talk about. India being the largest democracy and the most chaotic democracy, and America being the oldest democracy. So I think it was wonderful having both of you. Those of you who joined in late because you thought we will normally do it at 8 p.m., you can always watch this video on YouTube. It still remains on YouTube or on Facebook, and you can check it out again. And thank you very much, everyone. And Bogdan, anything you would like to say? I think Niranjan has already said his parting words. Bogdan, you would like to say anything?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I have to say that me having worked at Meridian, I'm so glad to see that this Meridian connection continues with Sujit, with your work that you're doing, the BAKUL Foundation. It was really an honor to be speaking today, and to have Niranjan as my counterpart on this. And I really valued his sort of insight, and I think. For me, not being so versed in Indian politics, was good to have that perspective being offered from his side. If I'll be happy to be back whenever you invite me. But thank you both so much for a very insightful and very engaging conversation. And thanks to all those who followed us, by the way.
Thank you. It was a fantastic conversation. And thanks, Sujit, and thanks, Bogdan, for great.
And for all the viewers and our speakers, if you would like, there's a very short film that we will sign off with.
In education that we are trying to promote reading. As statistics say, if 50% children in grade 5 cannot read the textbook of grade 2, then what is really happening? That's because the basic skills of reading and writing is not there. So we thought that if we have to change this cynicism, then we need to demonstrate what is possible with small contributions. So that is the idea basically that BAKUL is trying to demonstrate, what is possible entirely with volunteerism, entirely with small little contributions. We asked people to contribute books to set up a public library in Bhubaneswar, and a children's library was set up in Bhubaneswar, and now that children's library has become a general library, a public library with more than 20,000 books. So that is one of the major things. Another major area of intervention is environment. A lot of environmental education, but through films and through creative methods. So we have a traveling film festival on environment. We go to schools, colleges, apartments and screen films on environment, primarily on climate change and on issues of water and sanitation, two issues that we're working in. And at the libraries also, we conduct a lot of workshops on creativity. We all want the world to be a better place, and we have our own ideas of how it can be better. The thing is, can we all start in some small way towards addressing that? Can we say that in some small way, this world is the way I want it to be because I have done something about it?